So good morning to everyone joining us from Europe, but also good afternoon to those joining us from Australia. My name is Jerome Fournand. I'm the General Manager of the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Today, with our speakers and experts around this virtual table, Dr. Prue, Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, Jason Collins, the Chief Executive Officer of the European Australian Business Council, Reis, Partner Business Service at BDO, and also Caragh Johnson, the Director of Policy and Institutional Affairs at the European Australian Business Council. We would like to thank you all for your participation, and a special thank you to all European Chamber trade entities and partners for their support of this initiative, which aims to deliver practical, targeted insight on how to navigate and leverage the agreement as it moves into its ratification and implementation phase. Also, on their behalf, and I'm currently located in Sydney, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodian of this land, and pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. So briefly, to set up the scene of today, we will have the participation and discussion panel a little bit further. But before that, I would like to do a reminder to you all. As you know, this agreement sends a strong political signal for Australia to its partner across the world. It reflects a shared ambition to strengthen economic ties and create a more open and predictable environment for trade and investment. Importantly, this FTA is also designed to support both regions and businesses on both sides, whether a European company looking at Australia or Australian company expanding into Europe. It is about creating balanced opportunities and enabling growth in both directions. Beyond the immediate benefits, this agreement also represents a strategic milestone. Success here can pave the way for further cooperation and open, hopefully, the door to additional agreement and opportunity in the future. This webinar is also a first step in a broader series of initiatives and discussion we can have ahead of the ratification and implementation of the FTA. And I'm sure all our partners and EABC will keep the discussion ongoing until its implementation. A Q&A at the end will be available. You got the feature at the bottom of your screen, and if any question remain unanswered, we will come back to you by email. Before handing over to our experts and speakers, I would like to share also a brief summary of the survey results that help us shape this webinar. So you were around 20% of the attendees who complete this survey, covering a wide range of industry. You are from professional service to wholesale trade, from manufacturing and freight, among others. This gave us a good snapshot of who is in the room today and help us shape the focus on this discussion. Many of you were looking for an overview of the FTA current status and timeline, and Jason, following my quick introduction, will be able to provide that context in a couple of minutes. A large number of respondents also expressed interest in practical topics, particularly around market access, tariff, and mobility. Overall, feedback is broadly positive. The FTA is clearly seen as a strong and welcome framework, but response remain quite general, with a clear demand for more practical and operational insights. The key takeaway is that while there is a strong support for the agreement in principle, the main challenge now is implementation, turning this FTA into tangible business outcome. This includes addressing regulatory barriers such as certification and standards, improving access to clear and practical information, and supporting companies navigating market entry more effectively. In short, the FTA is well understood as an opportunity, but stakeholders are now looking for clarity and on how to make it work in practice. Without further ado, I will now open the floor to Jason Collins, CEO of the EABC, who will provide us with an overview of the FTA current status and timeline, the top request from you all attendees today at this webinar. Jason, I'll leave you the floor, and if you want to share, I think you got the feature as well at the bottom of your screen. Thank you, Jason.
Well, a very good morning from here in London. I've just spent a few days in Brussels and back to Brussels at the weekend, but it's great to be with everybody for the call today. Thanks very much to our partners at FACCI and indeed all of the other European chambers, many of whom are represented on the call today, but also to colleagues Prue Gordon and Anders Reith, who have been part of this journey, as many on this call have been for a long time in seeing this deal come to this really important stage. Look, just a few remarks about the significance of the deal that we now have in front of us. That is the most important starting point, is just to acknowledge just how significant it is that this deal has finally been concluded. Many observers have said that it wasn't possible to do a deal between the EU and Australia. The interests were too diametrically opposed on issues such as agricultural market access. And indeed, that was the most difficult part of the negotiation. But a negotiation was concluded, and this is huge. It's really important for a number of reasons. I'll quickly outline what those are. Firstly, depending upon, the figures vary, but the EU is either Australia's third or sometimes fourth, but it fluctuates, most important trading partner. It's Australia's second largest source of foreign direct investment, and any other metrics you could say, second biggest in terms of services trade and a whole range of things. So Europe really matters in terms of as an economic partner for Australia. Um, it's also, secondly, a 450 million 27 country bloc. It's the world's largest single trading bloc. And if Australia is to be serious about economic diversification and finding new markets to explore, then it needs markets that are open to Australian goods exports. And this is a huge opportunity for Australian exporters with, as I said, a market of 450 million people. Um, Thirdly, the geopolitical context is becoming more and more tougher, or even before geopolitical context, the EU has moved ahead and signed deals with its major trading partners, including Canada, Korea, Japan, and also very much increasing to do these deals in our part of the world. So, with Indonesia concluded last year, with Thailand also sometime. Sorry, I beg your pardon, Singapore, Vietnam, but also negotiations ongoing and with Thailand, Malaysia, and Philippines. So the EU is not holding back. It is rapidly advancing in getting these deals concluded. With New Zealand, of course, they did a couple of years ago. So we do need to have a relationship with the EU that is governed by a set of modern rules, which is what we have not had in this case. So that for European companies effectively operating at a competitive disadvantage in the Australian market, because Australia had been so successful at concluding deals with all of its other major trading partners. So, where European auto exporters to Australia faced a 5% tariff for automobiles being imported into Australia, that's separate to luxury car tax, just purely tariffs. Japanese exporters to the Australian market or from China or Korea didn't have those tariffs in place. Also, very important in terms of the investment sector and businesses generally is the lowest rate of threshold for FIRB approval processes to get investments into Australia. Again, European companies operating at quite a significant competitive disadvantage, given companies from all of those other FTA partners didn't have to face those same hurdles. So this is people, I think, would appreciate uh, the the extent to which this deal is going to change the whole economic relationship. That's the first and most important thing. Secondly, the prospects are very good. If we only look to some of the deals that the EU has done with Korea and Japan, to name two countries, or New Zealand, but also deals that Australia has done with other partners, trade, is conservatively estimated in all of the assessments of what it would look like to go up. But if you look at the reality, is these deals have delivered much more than that. In some cases, exponentially much more, as the confidence that is given to exporters' investments of having these deals in place look to the opportunities in new markets. So what we've found is that the confidence boosting effect has led to very sharp increases in the amount of economic activity, which I think we'd all say would be a very welcome thing in both directions. Getting to the question of the process, so the negotiations were launched in 2018. We have had a couple of hiccups along the way. Well, three main hiccups along the way. COVID, of course, made it very difficult for negotiations to be concluded during that period. We also had the rather unfortunate episode of AUKUS and the pause in negotiations as there was some of the fallout from that. And then we had a near-death experience, which are not uncommon in trade negotiations, of it getting to the wire on, okay, well, who's going to blink first on the agricultural market access question? And then negotiations halted while both sides regrouped and then after about 18 months got back to the table. So in terms of another thing which is often in the media and so on is, oh gosh, this negotiation took forever and all the rest of it. Yes, these negotiations do take a long period of time, but let me tell you, the EU's negotiations with the Mercosur countries for major Latin American economies took 26 years to negotiate. So our 7.5 probably, isn't so bad when looked at that. But of course, the most important thing is that we urgently conclude these deals, given the real state of the global turmoil and the difficulty. So negotiations were concluded in March this year with President von der Leyen's visit to Australia, very significant in itself, together with a security and defence partnership, separate to the FTA, but a no less important deal. And then some excellent news today, which was foreshadowed during that visit, of Australia's intention to join Horizon Europe, or will be joining Horizon Europe, the EU's flagship research and innovation program, 96 billion euros, the world's largest, which also includes a lot of Australia's major trading partners who are also members of that program. So that was the announcement in March. Now, what happens now? Again, this is not a simple process. So the whole deal needs to be what's known as legally scrubbed, which means it needs to go through technical processes in terms of what needs to change in terms of law and treaty text and so on. In the European Union's case, it needs to be translated into all 24 official languages of the European Union. And then it needs to go through parliamentary processes on both sides. So in the Australian case, the legal scrubbing is done, a vote is taken, or a passing of the deal is done at the Executive Council, so the federal government, not at the Parliament at that stage. And then it is scrutinised by the Parliament, by the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties, and then that concludes the process. The Governor-General will then sign the deal. In the EU's case, after the legal scrubbing and the translation into the 24 languages, the text of the deal will go to the European Council. That is the body which represents all of the governments of the 27 member states of the European Union. And then that being agreed to, it will then move from the Council to the European Parliament. Now, the European Parliament is a parliament that has representatives from all 27 countries of the European Union. It also has multiple political groups, spanning from the left to the right and everywhere in between. And then the International Trade Committee, and specifically, will look at it and make a recommendation on the deal. We're confident that the deal can be done. We'll be able to pass both systems, but there are no shortcuts here. So our urging is that both sides redouble efforts to speed up the process as much as they can. But we would be looking at a sort of 2027 scenario for all of those processes to be concluded. So there's, a 12 to 18 months horizon. There's no exact science on this, on to getting through. The most important thing is that the negotiations were concluded. That was the most difficult step. So the biggest hurdle, if you like, was done. But at the same time, we know that in these very volatile political times, we can't take any of the ratification processes for granted either. So we need to continue our advocacy, make sure that people from all stakeholder groups, both in Australia and in Europe, just appreciate that this is a comprehensive deal. It doesn't just deal with one section of the economy, it deals with the entire economy. The negotiators on both sides should be congratulated. They've managed to find, and the political leadership as well, who've managed to find solutions to the most sensitive issues. But just to reassure everybody on this call, this will be a transformational deal. It is not something that is sort of marginal. Will actually make a very different, big change. And I know we're going to have a terrific discussion with some excellent experts on this call, as in Prue and in Andres, who really understand the detail and also working with companies to take text of a treaty, text of a deal into practical realities, how things will change and make it easier for businesses to operate. So look forward to getting into that discussion.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think these little slides and all your comment about the process is greatly received by our attendants. As you know, it was the first question, and I suspect a lot of management and headquarters asking their local director, for example, what's going on? The FTA was signed, you did it, so what's now? But we still have some steps to go through before the implementation, and thank you for that. You also respond to my question around why this agreement matters at this point. I think you covered all the points, and I agree with you. So thank you, Jason, for all this insight. And if I may start the panel discussion with Prue. Prue, thank you so much for participating today. As you know, we wanted to do a webinar, a more practical webinar. So if we bring this down to a more practical level, and when businesses hear FTAs, they often think about, tariff, but this agreement goes well beyond that. From your perspective, what are the most significant practical opportunities created by this FTA across areas such as services, digital trade, investment, procurement, or movement of people, which was one of the main topics raised by our attendees as well. In particular, also, which element of this agreement are most likely to translate into tangible outcome for businesses, including aspects such as rules of origin, mutual recognition, regulatory cooperation, market access, and greater certainty for companies operating between Australia and Europe.
Thank you, Jerome. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be on this panel. For me, there are 6 substantive areas where there are real opportunities or real benefits for business from this agreement. And then there's a 7th, which is sort of an overarching benefit from this agreement. So let me touch on the 6 specific substantive outcomes that I see as key. The first one, which Jason actually mentioned, was the changes to the thresholds for review by the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board. So for some categories at the moment, European businesses need to submit investment applications to the Foreign Investment Review Board for anything over 347 million. As a result of the FTA, those businesses will now be not required to submit applications for screening under $1.498 billion. So the whole process of having an investment screened is laborious. There's lots of paperwork. It takes time. You have to often pay lawyers to do it. So being able to avoid that whole process in terms of making an investment into Australia will save businesses a lot of money, a lot of time, and it'll enable them to often action investments much more quickly than they would have had to do. So the changes in the investment screening thresholds is a key outcome. In terms of mobility, this agreement includes an innovation mobility pathway. Now, this is particularly targeted at researchers and technical specialists, European researchers and technical specialists coming to Australia, but also researchers from Australia going to Europe. And this provides particular pathways that really facilitate their travel and stay in each other's countries. Now, often when you have researchers and technical specialists going to other countries, that creates opportunities for sharing information, but also new opportunities for commercializing innovation. So while it might just be limited to individuals traveling to each other's countries, then the business opportunities created by that are multiplied. So I think this is a significant outcome from this particular FTA. Another key outcome are in the rules of origin. So these are relatively liberal rules of origin. So the rules of origin are what exporters of goods need to meet. So the rules they need to meet to demonstrate that their good is made in, for those goods coming to Australia, made in Europe, and vice versa. Those goods made in Australia meet the rule of origin for getting preferential access into Europe. So the rules are relatively liberal, which means you can incorporate some components from other countries and still meet the rule of origin to get preferential access into the other market. But another key part of the rules of origin is you just need to provide a declaration of origin rather than a certificate of origin. So you can say, well, my good meets the rule of origin because I've done the due diligence to be able to prove it. So I'm going to declare that my good meets the rule of origin, so should get the preferential tariff rate, as opposed to having to apply to another body and often pay for a piece of paper that says your good meets the rule of origin. So again, it's saving businesses time, it's saving the money. And it can be a small thing, but also it can make a big difference in terms of the profitability of trading with another market. So that's another great outcome from this trade agreement. Government procurement too. The Australian government has included new entities on its list of government agencies that will enable European companies to access procurement opportunities provided by these entities. We actually don't know which entities they are yet because I haven't seen the schedule. They haven't yet released the schedule, but they have, the Australian government has clearly said that there are more entities listed under the FTA than there are under Australia's World Trade Organization government procurement agreement entities. So that should create more opportunities for European countries to access procurement opportunities provided by these other government entities. And these can be very big purchasing agreements and services tendering opportunities. So they can be quite lucrative to access some of these government procurement contracts. I guess the fifth area for me is the inclusion of rules on digital trade. So things like not requiring companies to meet data localization requirements in Australia. We've extended through this FTA the commitment that Australia won't impose customs duties on e-transmissions, which is significant considering the commitment in the World Trade Organization, the moratorium on duties for e-transmissions, duties on e-transmissions recently ended in the WTO. So this is a commitment from Australia and the European Union to say they will not impose duties on electronic transmissions. So that's a good outcome. It also, the digital trade commitments also prevents the forced transfer of source code. And it also has a number of important rules on the recognition of paperless trade technologies, things like e-signatures, e-contracts, and e-authentication. Again, they seem like small things in and of themselves, but actually they can really add up for business in terms of savings, cost savings, and time savings. And the final sixth substantive issue for me was something that similarly Jason mentioned, that was the increase in the threshold for the luxury car tax on electronic vehicles. So at the moment, the two thresholds, so for all vehicles, it's about $80,567 for non-fuel efficient vehicles, and just over 91,000 for fuel efficient vehicles. Under the FTA, that's raised to $120,000. So again, a significant shift in the value of the threshold, which will mean European exporters of cars will be paying less duty. And so the cars will be more competitive in Australia. But I guess the seventh area for me, and the most important really, and again, it's not specific, it's across the whole FTA. We are currently in a global environment where countries are increasingly using trade as a weapon to achieve geostrategic and political outcomes. So having a trade agreement where you have the European Union and Australia committing to abide by these commitments creates much greater certainty for businesses who want to trade internationally in our two markets. And really the certainty provided by this agreement is absolutely critical to helping business manage the increased international market risk that we are seeing in the global economy. So for me, they're the 7 key practical outcomes from this agreement that I think will materially assist business to trade in each other's markets.
Thank you, Prue. Thank you. Very good insight around these 7 pillars. We have also with us today Andres from BDO. So you are in the front end with all the businesses looking at entering the market or doing more in this market, but also in the other way for Europe. So turning to the business perspective, and how are European companies operating in Australia currently reacting to this FTA? They will react better, obviously, after this webinar and learning more. But is there a clear understanding of what it will change in practice, or is there still a level of uncertainty?
Sure. Thanks, Jerome. It's great to be here and explain some of these matters. And it was even exciting for me to talk to some of my clients and my network around where they're seeing the applications of the free trade agreement. Yes, you're right. There is still a level of uncertainty around some matters around mobility and regulations. But overall, the feeling is positive. And I thought we might just do a little bit of a dive into the 5%, the free trade agreement, the tariffs. We can't forget about the 5%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you dig deep, it's actually worthwhile. Okay, so I've been talking to companies from large-scale renewable project managers, machinery importers at one level, bioscience importers of bioscience technology and innovation, and then also high volume, low margin retailers. And so the whole broad range of people that have different implications. And obviously there's some parts of the industry that don't pay the 5% at all at the moment. They get reprieve from that. For example, the medical industries. But the people that I've been talking to, they're saying this is great. So you can think of the 5% as being a saving of your costs, and you just pocket that. It goes straight to the bottom line, and hey, you've got 5% more profit. Or you could say we're now 5% more competitive. We can lower our prices and be in competition with, as Jason mentioned, Australia's suppliers from other countries that FTAs are already competing at that level. So now European countries can compete at that level as well. But then there's nuances. I had one retailer who says, well, we're going to spend that additional 5% on marketing. We're actually going to increase our market share in Australia. So, hey, we've just been getting leverage from the Australian government by being able to spend more on market share in Australia. So you're actually leveraging that 5% to get a benefit that's higher than 5% down the track, because you're increasing your share of market in Australia. The other one is large volume, low margin retailer, where your margins are actually less than 5%. So you might have products that are not viable in the Australian market at the moment. But once the FTA kicks in and you are saving that 5%, no tariffs to be paid, there might be products in your product range that are now viable in the Australian market. And so again, you can expand in the Australian market through that, which is fascinating. And so that got me thinking, if you have French customers, you have French companies that may not be viable to bring their products. You might have geographical indicators, companies, champagne, artisan cheesemakers, wineries that currently can't see themselves into Australia because of the freight cost, the distances, but maybe the 5% makes the difference between them coming into the country or not. So there's expansionary mechanisms there. The other one that Prue mentioned around procurement and tenders, these large-scale tenders, you wonder whether the 5% may actually be the difference between winning or losing a tender project in Australia. The margins are often tight. It's often, how do you get into Australia? Well, you've got to win a tender. Well, now you've got 5% more to play with in terms of the machinery, all the equipment you've got to bring in. So I think the 5% in and of itself makes a huge difference for companies considering the Australian market or those that are already in the market, how to expand. So we might leave it at that for the tariffs. Yes, we'll get to the other parts that may create a bit more uncertainties, but I think you'll cover that in the rest of your questions.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much. And you're right. I like the idea of this portfolio of product that could increase within the brand already located here, because it become more relevant to have this product line here in Australia. Prue, maybe we build on what Andres has said, because talking about barrier, is there a risk that businesses expect this FTA to remove barriers that are actually regulatory or operational in nature rather than tariff related? And if I may ask you as well, where do you see the main gaps between the agreement on paper and its implementation in practice, including how the FTA interact with domestic law, such as sustainability provisions, geographical indication, and other regulatory frameworks you may know?
It's a great question because often business will just think, we've got an FTA, we can do whatever we like. But that's definitely not the case with any FTA. There are still a lot of domestic regulatory requirements that apply to both domestic as well as foreign investors and foreign traders coming into Australia and vice versa. One area that stands out for me and that I've had quite a lot to do with, where the expectation and the regulatory requirement don't quite align, that's around professional services recognition. And the reason for that is the federal government that negotiates these trade agreements doesn't have authority or responsibility for regulating Australia's professions. It sits both with state and territory regulators, but also with professional associations. So lawyers, accountants, engineers. Well, actually, engineers in Australia, there is no certification requirement for an engineer. So that's no problem for European engineers coming in. For lawyers, that's regulated at the state level. But we do have a what's called like a passport, where if you're registered in one jurisdiction, you can be registered in others. But again, that requires a foreign lawyer who wants to come and practice either foreign law in Australia or practice local law. They need to meet state and territory regulatory requirements. Accountants, it sits with professional bodies. So registration as an accountant with CPA or our chartered accountants. So while the FTA might create new opportunities for some categories of service suppliers, there's still the requirement for foreign professionals coming in to meet these other regulatory requirements. And while the FTA will set up a process for trying to get the relevant regulatory bodies together to discuss mutual recognition, it's not automatic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So to stay on the topic of the non-tariff barriers and business friction, Andres, on your side, with your experience on the ground, where do you see business facing still the most significant friction today? Are there particular sector with certification requirements, standards, or compliance process that continue to create barriers, even in the context of this agreement?
So look, there's certainly my big machinery importers that have safety standards to meet in Australia. They will continue facing those because the Standards Australia, they reserve the right to test machines themselves and make sure that they're safe for Australian users, for Australian industry. But in terms of fire and mechanical, electrical, we have a different electrical system here. We have a different standard safety procedures here. So they need to be tested. It would be great to see that the Australian standards would accept the CE symbol that's well known in Europe. What I've heard in terms of positive news is that some of my clients are saying that Australian standards are now looking at the CE as supporting documents. They are not really accepting it one for one. They're not saying you've got a CE stamp, therefore we're going to give you our stamp necessarily. But they are reducing the levels of testing if you have a CE stamp on your European machine. So there is, I think, we need to use the advocacy that we've spoken about in terms of landing on the FDA to do more so with our peak bodies, our Standards Australia, and to Prue's point, maybe Institute of Chartered Accountants and the like, to accept more of the European peak body certifications. The other one is obviously in the medical field, TGA. I don't think TGA will ever just simply accept a drug that's been accepted in Europe as being okay to admit to the Australian environment. But hopefully there is talks going on, as I know from some of my clients, there are talks going on behind the scene. This is not something at FDA level, as Prue mentioned. This doesn't happen at FDA level. But maybe one thing can lead to another where reducing red tape, reducing regulations is a good thing for both the EU and Australia. And hopefully those talks will continue going on.
Thank you, Andres. And you're right. As a matter of introduction, when I said that this FTA can pave the way to the win, it doesn't come from me. I guess I should acknowledge Jason's or Andres' quote during a rehearsal. But you're right. All this discussion could be engaged as well in parallel of following the implementation of the FTA. Thank you so much, Andres. Going to a topic that has been quite often highlighted by our attendee and during the survey is the mobility and talent. Another important theme that came through. So, Andres, how do business view the outcome in this area? Do you have a lot of business calling you at the moment saying, look, would it be easier to go through this process? Are the change meaningful in practice?
I think there's probably not as much in the FTA as we had hoped around mobility of people. But the things that are positive, there are positive signs, and where it matters to some of my clients, so for example, the large building projects. I have a client who has projects that last from 6 months to 18 months. They need engineers, by the plane loads basically coming in. They have 50 to 100 engineers from overseas on the ground here at any one point in time. And getting visas for those 50 to 100 people is not just costly, but also timely. You can't wait on your building site to wait for these visas to be approved. And so the FTA certainly mentions that intercompany transfers, short-term construction or contractors, I should say, are more easily able to move under the FTA policies. So we're hoping that will turn into value for our clients. The other one is just generally, like even for BDO, during audit season, we need more auditors. Where can we get them from? Okay, let's get them from Europe. Let's bring them over for a season for 3 months. So intercompany transfers should be much easier to do. The other one that Prue mentioned in her amazing 7 points that she had was the mobility of researchers. I have a medical devices company that is looking to starting a research project in Australia, needing about 20 people to come over from their head office to land in Australia to start a research project. Again, there's specific policy notes in the FTA just around that sort of opportunity. So while it's not as broad as some of us may have hoped, there are certainly aspects there that are very positive.
Thank you, Andres. And you make me think about another initiative we delivered around the federal budget and all the research and development here in Australia as well for especially the new startup and framework that should support that in some way. Prue, you touched base already on the mobility, but is there anything else you would like to add on this from a policy perspective on where the most tangible improvement are?
I guess I don't want to be a dampener on it, but my understanding is Australia won't be changing its immigration law in order to bring itself into compliance with this FTA. So while the categories identified in the FTA of intercorporate transferees and service suppliers are named and identified, my understanding is they are consistent with Australia's WTO obligations. So there won't, other than the innovation mobility pathway, there won't be any new access provided for Europeans. That said, I would absolutely emphasize that in this environment where open trade policy settings can be reversed and are being reversed, locking in that commitment for professionals and for service suppliers to move between our two economies is a really important commitment.
Thank you, Prue. Thank you very much. Once again, just to highlight, of course, this FTA is a benefit for both region, Australia and Europe. We mentioned a lot of inbound and Australia environment due to our location and where we are, but we know that we have a number of entity and businesses in Europe listening and in Australia looking at investing more in Europe, and this is a win-win situation once again. Talking about win, Jason, EABC. Stepping back again, the discussion highlighted that the FTA is only part of a wider regulatory landscape. Issues such as carbon regulation, sustainability framework, broader compliance requirement sit outside this agreement, but still impact businesses. Can this FTA nevertheless serve as a platform to improve broader regulatory cooperation and dialogue between Europe and Australia? If I may do a remark, you successfully participate and supported this great news. I'm sure you will have other great, battle to or at least project to support in the future. Which one would it be?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think whilst we acknowledge all of the great things that are part of it, this FTA won't solve every issue, and there will be a lot of ongoing work that's required. But also, we need to make sure that everything is effectively implemented. So whilst we won't have comprehensive reform in terms of movement of people, we will have some very positive, and that's been explored. But now we need to make sure that that actually delivers, because a lot of the things which Andres is referring to are just very practical things. Look, can we get things processed quickly so we can get people? So, so the implementation part is really important in this next phase. But in terms of some of the biggest issues confronting our economies, and I guess, how do we regulate AI, would be a standout one there. We've got to have a much better way of working with economic partners to try and solve these problems together, rather than setting up a whole bunch of new regulations, new regulators, and so on. And then in 10 years' time going, oh, well, we better have a dialogue on how we can try to get better coherence around how we've approached AI. Why don't we actually have those conversations now? So having a free trade agreement is not just about regulating transactions. It's also about having real institutional activity that tries to sort of anticipate issues that are coming forward in the future. Without having that FTA in place, it would be impossible to do that. So joining with the European partners to get this FTA done, but also then ongoing regulatory dialogue on how do we, find better ways, for example, on the recognition of skills. As Prue identified, it's very, very difficult. Not just in Australia, it's also difficult in Europe, where you have different levels of recognition of professional qualifications and so on. But let's have a dialogue on how we can actually improve these areas so that you don't have, as we all know, those ridiculous circumstances of highly qualified people moving between places and having to effectively totally requalify in order to, because in a lot of those areas, these are skills that both economies need. So, it actually is a really important thing to get some of these things right. So this FTA gives us the right framework to be able to have these ongoing dialogues and exchanges. I mentioned Horizon Europe's innovation was mentioned as well. At the appropriate time, Jerome, it would be great to bring in my colleague Caragh on this, because this is a fantastic announcement about Australian and Europe's innovation ecosystems, which is not just in ivory tower universities, very important places where that happens, but it's also in industry, and it's and as we know, so many Australian universities are doing amazing technology and research. But what we've got to do is find better ways to actually apply that and working with industry to deliver real commercial outcomes.
Thank you, Jason. And you're right. We often see as well businesses changing very quickly compared to other regulators or bodies. So you're right. I think the discussion needs to happen as soon as possible, as the world is changing very, very quickly. And we need to cope with that and make sure that we have the clear and relevant rules around the business that already changed today. So thank you so much. And of course, Caragh, you're very happy for you to step in. And maybe, yes, Caragh?
Thank you. Maybe just add to a point that people have been making, just around the something that Prue said in one of our earlier chats before the session was sort of framing the FTA as sort of a head turner for business. But more than just business, it's also an important signal to officials in both markets, whether it be sort of EU member states or EU and Australian officials. So they're having the FTA can sort of act as a catalyst for things like double taxation agreements, which many of which have already been negotiated. Some need to be updated. Some have never been negotiated before. And while that's not an EU-Australia issue, that's at the member state Australia level, having the FTA can act as a catalyst for those sorts of areas. But also the FTA and the Security and Defence Partnership provide another opportunity for Australian businesses, but also for European subsidiaries that are based in Australia. The European Union, but also Australia, we're looking to frame everything now in sort of security terms and trusted partnerships. And some of the mechanisms coming through, for example, the EU's Industrial Accelerator Act, they're introducing sort of public procurement settings that have sort of clean tech preferences, but also made in Europe preferences. So one example of how this helps is that by having the FTA and once it enters into force, companies based in Australia, the products that they're producing will get classified essentially as being made in Europe. And as European, because they are part of that trusted partner framework. And likewise, with the Security and Defence Partnership, that facilitates European subsidiaries in Australia being able to access the huge procurement markets for defence in Europe at the moment, including SAFE. So maybe just those couple of points just to add there, and hand over back to you.
Thank you, Caragh. Very insightful. So before to look at the Q&A, because you're right, there were some questions in the Q&A, but firstly, to conclude the discussion, I would like to ask you, each of you, the final question. So not the easiest one, but in one sentence, what is the single most important priority, whether for government, business, organization, or company, to ensure this agreement delivers real value over the next 2 to 3 years and beyond? Prue, let's start by you.
I would say, diversification is absolutely critical for managing international market risk in this current environment. So over and above the outcomes from the agreement itself, I think a key deliverable, a key benefit for business from this agreement is actually the head-turning effect that Caragh mentioned, which is businesses identifying commercial opportunities for new trade and investment with Australia and Australia with the EU, and building those commercial ties. I think this agreement has the opportunity to provide businesses with a window into each other's economies that didn't exist before.
Thank you, Prue. Andres? You're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to echo Prue's comments to say this is convincingly positive, this development. And I think we need to focus on the things that it does provide rather than focusing on the things that haven't been mentioned or not adequately mentioned in the FTA. This is a positive development for European business, for French businesses, in your case, for European businesses. Also for Australian, we haven't really focused on Australian companies going into Europe. But that expansion effect that Prue mentions, but also for existing companies, how they can expand their market presence in Australia or in Europe, depending on the case.
Thank you, Andres. Caragh?
Perhaps I'll just take a slightly different approach and focus on the short term. There is no guarantee that this sort of all goes smoothly in the ratification process. And so I think our focus at the moment is ensuring that businesses are speaking to their government representatives and being supportive of the FTA, acknowledging where they're not necessarily completely satisfied, but understanding that this is a first step and an incredibly important platform. As I say, it's not guaranteed that this gets the positive response from Parliament in Australia. Likewise, the European Parliament, although that's actually looking a lot more positive than the Australian context at the moment. And it's incredibly important that everyone sort of speaks up at the moment when they're engaging on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Caragh. Jason?
Thank you. Look, Caragh has just made the really critical point that I wanted to emphasize is that we need to, and Andres and Prue have as well, is that no trade agreement is a perfect deal. There were lots of stakeholders that didn't get what they legitimately wanted out of Australia's deal with the United States, Australia's deal with various other things, because the political leadership on both sides have to take into account, highly sensitive sectors and all the rest. So the most important thing is that there are massive advances right across the economy. Every sector does gain under this deal. Not every sector gains as much as they would have liked to. And as I say, would legitimately want and expect to be able to get from a deal. Australian agricultural exporters in certain sectors did very well. In other sectors, didn't do as well. And so in that sense, they have a right to be disappointed. But certainly improving is better than not having any outcome, either for their sector or for any sector, by not having a deal done at all. So it is really important that I think, as Caragh said, that the message gets out as loudly as possible, that this will be a transformational deal. The work doesn't end there. We'll continue to advocate for more access. Would love to have seen, for example, the luxury car tax be abolished in total. That didn't happen, but we did get some positive advances in terms of the EV market, which Prue mentioned. So the urgency, given all of the geopolitical risk and uncertainty these days, is about getting this deal done as quickly as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Jason. And yes, part of my introduction, I was saying this webinar is one step of a broader series. And hearing you as well, Caragh, when you said that we need to keep talking and engaging around us with public and private bodies. Because there is a long way to still to walk through this journey before the implementation, and political, stance can happen as well in our world. So we need to be aware that it's a continuous project to support. So thank you to all of you, Prue, Andres, Jason, Caragh. We will have a quick Q&A to stay on time, but what has clearly emerged from this discussion at my end and with my note is that while this FTA creates important opportunities, its real value will depend on its implementation, awareness as well, and this is why we do such webinar, and the ability of business to translate this agreement into practical outcome. When I will send the thank you email to our attendees, you will have the contact detail as well of our speakers and experts today. So please feel free to reach out if you need support. It is a wealth of knowledge and expertise around this virtual roundtable. So now we have 4 minutes, so not much, but I will open the floor. And we had a question. You mentioned Horizon, and you mentioned Horizon that you received some good news today. So I don't know if Caragh will take the floor on this item, but that was one of the questions from our attendees. And what does it mean for Australian businesses? Yes.
Thank you. Yes, we had the terrific news overnight for Jason and I, because we're in Europe at the moment, that the negotiations have concluded. Now, this is not for infinity and beyond. This is for the last year of the current framework program. So that means that from the beginning of 2027, Australian researchers and industry will be able to participate on equal terms under Horizon Europe Pillar 2. What this essentially means is that they can lead consortia and access the fund in a much more sort of equal way to European researchers and industry, but also other Horizon Europe associate members. We've managed to get to this step essentially because there's a burden sharing from the Australian government and the group of 8 universities who are splitting the cost 50-50 to enable, and not for just group of 8 researchers, but for all Australian industry and researchers to be able to access the fund. And what's really important here is that we make sure that researchers who I think already understand what Horizon Europe is, but that Australian industry, but also European subsidiaries in Australia, because they, of course, through their parent companies will have an understanding of how transformational this can be in terms of not just doing that core research, but the commercialization opportunities. And it ties in perfectly with this innovation pathway. Now, the FDA is unlikely to be in force for this 27 to 28 access, but it's a sort of starting point for Australia to start understanding how Horizon Europe works and being able to access the fund, and hopefully will show the Australian government how successful it is before the end of the year, and they will try and access FP10. I think Jason mentioned that Horizon Europe is 95.5 billion. It's the largest collaborative innovation program in the world. And the next program, which is currently being negotiated, is set to sort of double that funding. So incredible opportunities, and also happy to answer questions offline about that.
Jerome, if I could just add to that point, it really is significant because, as we know in Australia, again, we're fantastic hands-on research happening in Australian universities that is world-class. What we don't have is the sort of industry partnerships that develop to sort of commercial outcomes. Europe really does this well. Europe is an innovation powerhouse. And whether you look at the Global Innovation Index or whatever, you look at least 50% of the top ranking countries in the world are all Europeans. We need to find better ways to navigate and align on this. But also, too, with so much of what's happening in Australian domestic economic debate, transition to net zero, energy transition more broadly, National Reconstruction Fund in terms of, well, how does Australia develop more sovereign capability and so on. All of that has to be delivered by expertise, by high quality capital, and by enabling technologies. So the more that Australia can do with European partners on that innovation ecosystem, that's good for Australia. It's not just about doing favours for partners in Europe. That's actually the sort of thing that Australia needs in order to address some of those big key challenges. So Horizon Europe speaks to that, but also the FTA, as we've been discussing, also speaks to that, as does the Security and Defence Partnership. All of these agreements are actually, good for Australia in terms of what they can help deliver.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much, Caragh, as well. I'm conscious of the time, and we had a couple more questions, but maybe we can take one more around. I've got one around investor, businesses and investor. As one of our attendees mentioned, that there is no investor-state dispute settlement system in the FTA. That will be for Prue, this question, I guess.
Yes, look, I think it's no problem at all that there is no ISDS provisions in this agreement, because both Australia and Europe have highly advanced legal systems, highly transparent processes, appeal processes. So, ISD was originally designed for investors going into countries where those kinds of systems didn't exist to the same level as they did in Australia. So I don't see there being any problem at all for investors that there is no ISDS provision in this FTA.
Thank you, Prue. Let's conclude with this answered and good news then. Thank you all again. I think a first step for a broader series. And thank you again, Andres, Caragh, Prue, Jason. It was a pleasure to organize this webinar with you. As you know, you are the expert around the table, and we will send a thank you email to our attendee with your contact details if the discussion needs to go further. But I wish you all the best in Europe, Jason and Caragh. Bring us more good news. That will be perfect. Andres, Prue, I salute you as well from Australia. And thank you again to all our partner, European chambers, bodies, entity, Department of Foreign Affairs joining us today. We all very thankful for this FTA to be signed between two regions that we cherish and we love. We want the best for both regions, and we will work, every day we are working hard to make sure that this is happening and we achieve this goal. So thank you so much to all of you. We will send you the link for the replay as well if you want to share it with your colleague, friends. But again, awareness is important, so feel free to share that too. Thank you so much. I wish you a good day for those in Europe and a good evening for those in Australia. Thank you so much.
Merci, Jerome.
Merci.
Thanks very much. All the best.